I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
I was at my desk in the office, catching up on the bank balance and wondering if the price of oil was going to make Fritz rethink his recipe for soupe à l'oignon, when the doorbell rang. It was 11:15 on a Tuesday morning. At that hour, Nero Wolfe is up in the plant rooms with Theodore and 10,000 orchids, behaving as if the rest of the world is a minor inconvenience he hasn't quite gotten around to abolishing. I crossed the foyer, glanced through the one-way glass of the front door, and saw something that didn't belong on a West 35th Street stoop. It was a man who looked like he had been assembled from discarded pipe cleaners, wearing a Harris tweed suit that cost more than my car, and carrying a leather portfolio, as if it contained the original stone tablets from Sinai. He wasn't just nervous, he was vibrating. I opened the door. "Good morning. If you're selling encyclopedias, we have them. If you're looking for the precinct, it's around the corner. I am here to see Mr. Nero Wolfe," he sped. His voice had the thin, reedy quality of a clarinet played by a beginner. "It is a matter of—" "Well, it isn't a matter of life and death, Mr. Goodwin. It is much more important than that. It is a matter of history." "Mr. Wolfe is with his orchids," I told him, leaning against the doorframe. "He doesn't see anyone without an appointment before lunch, and even then, he prefers them to have a checkbook and a damn good reason. I have both." He fumbled with a card. "Julian Vane, curator of the Sterling Hale Archive." I knew the name. The Sterling Hale was a private library uptown that specialized in the kind of dusty papers that people kill for in movies but usually just argue about in academic journals. I let him in, partly because he looked like he might collapse on the welcome mat, and partly because Wolfe had been grumbling about the price of the new hybrid odontoglossum, and a wealthy curator was as good as a stimulus check. I parked him in the red leather chair and went to the kitchen to tell Fritz to hold off on any mid-morning snacks. Then I waited. At 11 sharp, the elevator groaned, and the master of the house emerged. He navigated the hallway with the deliberate gaito. An ocean liner entering a harbor, and settled into his specially reinforced chair behind the desk. He didn't look at Vane. He looked at the mail. "Archie," Wolfe said, his voice a deep, melodic rumble. "There is a draft." "That's not a draft, it's Mr. Julian Vane," I said. "He says history is at stake. He also has a checkbook." Wolfe's eyes, as black and sharp as obsidian, shifted to the man in tea. He read chair. He sighed, a sound of profound suffering. "Mr. Vane, I do not like history. It is a record of human fallibility that cannot be corrected. What do you want?" Vane leaned forward, his knuckles white on his portfolio. "Mr. Wolfe, 3 days ago, the only existing manuscript of Thomas Heywood's lost play, The Cuckold of Cripplegate, vanished from a sealed vault at the Sterling Hale. It is worth $400,000 at auction, but to the world of letters, it is priceless." Wolfe poured a glass of beer from the tray Fritz had brought in. He watched the foam settle with intense concentration. "Theft is a matter for the police, Mr. Vane. I am not a recovery agent for delinquent librarians. The police cannot be involved," Vane whispered. "The donor, Mrs. Beatrice Sterling, still alive. If she finds out the archive's security was breached, she will revoke the entire endowment. We would be ruined. But more importantly, the thief left something behind." He opened the portfolio and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He didn't hand it to Wolfe. He laid it on the desk as if it were radioactive. I stood up and looked over Wolfe's shoulder. It wasn't a ransom note. It was a recipe. Specifically, a handwritten recipe for quenelles de brochet, written in a precise, elegant script that I recognized instantly. Wolfe went rigid. He didn't touch the paper. He didn't have to. He knew that handwriting. It belonged to the only man Wolfe had ever truly considered an equal in the kitchen, and perhaps a superior in mischief, a man who had been dead for 3 years. "That," Wolfe said, his voice dropping an octave into a zone of pure, freezing threat, "is a forgery, or a desecration." "It was pinned to the empty velvet lining of the manuscript case," Vane said, "with a pearl-headed hat pin." Wolfe's fingers tightened on his beer glass. The The sanctity of the brownstone hadn't been breached yet, but the sanctity of his peace was gone. Someone was using his past and his to bait him. Archie, Wolfe snapped. Yeah? Find out who was in that archive, and tell Fritz we will not be having the lamb for lunch. I've lost my appetite for anything but the truth. I reached for my hat. When Wolfe loses his appetite, it usually means someone else is about to lose their mind. The office felt smaller than usual, which is what happens when Nero Wolfe decides to take an interest in a case that offends his sensibilities. He sat behind his desk, a mountain in a bespoke silk vest, staring at the forged recipe as if he could make the ink confess its origins through sheer willpower. Julian Vane had stopped vibrating and had settled into a state of limp exhaustion in the red leather chair. I took my notebook out, flipped to a fresh page, and waited for the interrogation to begin. It wasn't just about a stolen play anymore. It was about the fact that someone had used the ghost of a dead chef and a recipe for pike dumplings to get Wolfe's attention. That was like poking a hibernating grizzly with a very expensive stick. Wolfe finally shifted his gaze to Vane. Who has access to this vault, Mr. Vane? Do not give me a list of everyone with a library card. I want the names of those who could navigate your security without leaving a trail for the police you are so desperate to avoid. Vane wiped his forehead with a linen handkerchief. The Sterling Hale is a private institution, Mr. Wolfe. The inner sanctum, the vault where the Heywood manuscript was kept, requires a biometric scan and a physical key. Only 4 people besides myself have that level of clearance. We were all there on the night it vanished. We were hosting a small private viewing for potential benefactors. It was a gala of sorts, though quite intimate. Names, Wolfe uttered. It wasn't a request, it was an order. First there is Arthur Penhaligon, Vane began, his voice thin. He is our chief bibliographer. He's been with the archive for 30 years. He lives for the smell of old parchment. And hasn't had a social life since the Truman administration. He was the one who discovered the theft the following morning. He was hysterical. I noted down Penhaligon, old, dusty, prone to hysterics. Who's next? I asked. Dr. Elena Vance. She's a visiting scholar from Oxford, brilliant, young, and remarkably ambitious. She's been writing a monograph on Elizabethan drama and had been granted special permission to study the Heywood manuscript for her research. She was the last person seen in the vault before the gala began. Ambitious, Wolfe repeated, the word tasting like vinegar in his mouth. An ambitious scholar is a creature of infinite resource and no conscience. Go on. Then there is Silas Thorne, Vane continued. He's a collector, a man of immense wealth, and I'm a rather predatory instinct for rare acquisitions. He's been trying to buy the manuscript from the archive for years to protect it in his private collection. He was a guest at the gala, and he spent a significant amount of time in the gallery adjacent to the vault. And the 4th? I prompted. Vane hesitated, looking at his shoes. Beatrice Sterling's nephew, Marcus Sterling, he's a bit of, a disappointment to the family. He's a gambler, heavily in debt, but he serves on the board of directors because of his name. He was there that night, drinking heavily and making a general nuisance of himself. He's the one Mrs. Sterling is most likely to protect, and the one most likely to sell a national treasure to cover a horse race in Saratoga. Wolfe grunted. It was a sound that and he had heard enough to form a preliminary distaste for everyone involved. 4 suspects. A scholar, a bibliographer, a predator, and a fool. And you, Mr. Vane, you were also there. You have the keys. You have the access. I would never, Vane cried, nearly leaping out of the chair. That archive is my life's work. Men often destroy the things they love when they can no longer afford to maintain them, Wolfe remarked dryly. Archie, you will go to the Sterling Hale. I want a description of the vault's perimeter, the guest list from the gala, and a private word with this Arthur Penhaligon. If he is as devoted to the paper as Mr. Vane suggests, he will be the most likely to have noticed a nuance the thief overlooked. What about the recipe? I asked, gesturing to the paper on the des. Kay, if that's the hook, shouldn't we be looking for someone who knows your history with the kitchen? Wolfe's eyes narrowed. The recipe is a provocation. It suggests the thief is not merely a criminal, but a student of my habits, or perhaps a student of the man whose hand they attempted to mimic. It is an intellectual challenge, Archie. The thief isn't just stealing a manuscript, they are performing a play for an audience of one. Me. I stood up and put my notebook in my pocket. I'll start with the hysterical bibliographer. Maybe he can tell me why a thief would leave a hatpin behind. It seems a bit old-fashioned even for a rare book room. It is a signature, Wolfe said, his voice trailing off as he picked up the recipe again. A very specific, very sharp signature. Go, Archie. And do not be late for dinner. Fritz is preparing a fricandeau of veal, and I will not have it ruined by your preoccupation with academic thieves. I walked out to the hallway, grabbed my hat and coat from the rack and checked my reflection in the mirror. I looked like a man about to spend an afternoon surrounded by people who thought a missing piece of paper was more important than a good steak, which meant I needed to be on my toes. As I stepped out onto the stoop and felt the crisp New York air, I couldn't shake the feeling that the recipe wasn't just a clue, it was a warning. Someone knew exactly how to get Nero Wolfe out of his chair, even if they had to dig up the past to do it. I hailed a cab and gave the driver the address for the Sterling Hale archive, wondering if Dr. Elena Vance was ambitious as Vane said, and if she was the type to carry a pearl-headed hatpin. The archive was located in a converted limestone mansion on East 72nd Street, a place that screamed old money and hush. When I stepped inside, the air was filtered and chilled to a temperature that favored vellum over human comfort. I found Julian Vane's office, but he wasn't there yet. Instead, I found a woman standing by a glass display case staring at nothing. She was tall, with sharp features and eyes that looked like they had spent a lot of time reading small print in bad light. "You must be Dr. Vance," I said, putting on my best. "I'm just a curious visitor," smile. She turned, her gaze raking over me with the clinical detachment of a biologist looking at a new strain of bacteria. "I am." "And you are?" "Not a scholar." "You move too much. Who are you?" "Archie Goodwin. I'm here on behalf of Mr. Nero Wolfe. We're looking for a lost play and a missing sense of humor. Have you seen either?" She didn't blink. "Mr. Wolfe is a detective, isn't he?" I suppose Vane finally grew a spine. "You're wasting your time, Mr. Goodwin. The manuscript is gone, and the person who took it is far cleverer than anyone in his building, including your employer." "That's a bold claim," I said. "Wolfe usually takes that kind of talk as a personal invitation. Tell me, Doctor, do you usually pin your notes with hat pins, or do you prefer paper clips?" For the first time, a flicker of something, not fear but genuine interest, crossed her face. "A hat pin? How remarkably Victorian. If I were to steal something, Mr. Goodwin, I wouldn't leave a calling card. I would simply leave." She walked away before I could ask a follow-up, her heels clicking a rhythmic, dismissive beat on the marble floor. I watched her go, thinking that if she wasn't the thief, she certainly had the temperament for it. I turned my attention toward the back of the building, where the vault was located, and where I expected to find a very nervous art. Her Penhaligon. I found him in a small, cramped office that smelled of glue and peppermint. He was hunched over a desk, his back to the door, muttering to himself. When I cleared my throat, he jumped so hard he nearly knocked over a bottle of ink. He was exactly as Vane had described, a man made of dust and nerves. "Mr. Penhaligon?" I asked. Yes, what is it?" "We're closed to the public. The archive is in a state of transition. I'm Archie Goodwin. Nero Wolfe sent me. He's interested in the way the Haywood manuscript left the building. He thinks it might have had help." Penhaligon's face went grey. "Help? It was a violation, a surgical strike. I was the one who locked the vault. I checked the seals. Everything was perfect. And then, the next morning, the velvet was empty. It was like a ghost had reached through the glass." "Ghosts don't leave recipes," I said, leaning against his desk, "and they don't use hatpins. Tell me about the gala. Who was standing closest to the vault when the lights were low?" He began to tremble, his fingers plucking at the edge of a blotter. "Everyone. No one. It was a blur of silk and champagne. But I remember Silas Thorne. He wouldn't stop tearing at the case. He looked at that manuscript the way a wolf looks at a wounded deer. And Marcus Sterling, he was everywhere he shouldn't be. But the vault is impossible. Nothing is impossible, I told him. It just costs more or takes longer. Let's take a look at this impossible vault, shall we? The vault at the Sterling Hale Archive was a masterpiece of cold gleaming engine. Airing that looked entirely out of place in a building filled with crumbling parchment. It was a room within a room, a cube of reinforced steel and glass that sat in the center of the gallery like a high-tech aquarium. Arthur Penhaligon led me toward it with the mournful air of a priest visiting a desecrated shrine. He pointed a shaking finger at the central pedestal where the Hayward manuscript, a collection of hand-stitched pages from the early 17th century, had sat until 72 hours ago. Now, the pedestal held nothing but a square of dark blue velvet and the lingering sense of a catastrophe. I circled the cube, looking for the physical evidence of a breach. There were no scratches on the glass, no scorched marks from a laser, and the biometric scanner on the door hummed with the quiet efficiency of a machine that believed it was doing its job. I've seen enough clever thieves to know that the most impressive heists don't involve dynamite. They involve knowing the right person or the right secret. I spent 40 minutes poking around, checking the floor vents and the ceiling panels, while Penhaligon stood by and offered a running commentary of size. It was a dead end in terms of forensics, which meant the legwork had to move from the scene of the crime to the people who inhabited it. I left the archive and spent the next 4 hours doing what I do best, making people uncomfortable. I started with Marcus Sterling. I found him at a private club on 52nd Street that smelled of expensive tobacco and desperation. He was sitting at the bar, looking like a man had been wearing the same shirt for 2 days, and didn't see the point in changing it now. He was Beatrice Sterling's nephew, but the family resemblance stopped at the chin. He had a weak mouth and eyes that were constantly shifting, looking for an exit or a refill. "Mr. Sterling," I said, taking the stool next to him, "I'm Archie Goodwin. I work for Nero Wolfe." He didn't even turn his head. "Whoa." "LFE, the fat man who grows weeds. Tell him to stay out of family business. My aunt is paying him to find a piece of paper that's probably been mislaid by that dither of Vane." "It wasn't mislaid," I said. "It was replaced by a recipe for pike dumplings." "Do you like fish, Mr. Sterling? Or do you prefer the kind of steaks you find at the track?" He stiffened, his glass pausing halfway to his lips. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do. You're in deep to a few gentlemen who don't take recipes as collateral. A $400,000 manuscript would clear your books nicely. You were at the gala, you have board-level access, and you've got a motive that's currently breathing down your neck. How did you get into the vault?" Sterling turned then, and I saw the sweat on his upper lip. "I didn't. I couldn't. I don't have the biometric clearance, and even if I did, I wouldn't know a Hayward manuscript from a Sunday comic. If you want a thief, talk to Silas Thorne. He was hovering over that case all night like a vulture. He's got a private vault in his townhouse that probably has half the stolen history of Europe in it. Go bother him." I thanked him for the tip and left. Him to his drink. Silas Thorne was a different breed of suspect. His townhouse on Park Avenue was a fortress of limestone and silence. I didn't get past the butler, but I did manage to catch Thorne as he was stepping into a chauffeured Cadillac. He was a man who looked like he had been carved out of flint, hard, grey, and entirely unapologetic. "Mr. Thorne," I said, stepping into his path. "Archie Goodwin. I'm looking for a lost play. Word on the street is you have a very fine collection of things that aren't supposed to be for sale." Thorne stopped and looked at me. His eyes were cold and perfectly still. "Mr. Goodwin, I am aware of your employer's reputation. Tell Mr. Wolfe that if I had the Hayward manuscript, I would be celebrating with a bottle of Mouton Rothschild, not talking to a PR. I've ate detective on the sidewalk. I made an offer to the archive 3 times. They refused. I do not steal what I can eventually buy at a discount when an institution fails. And if you couldn't wait?" "I am a patient man," Thorne said, his voice like grinding stones. Ambition is for the young and the desperate, like that girl Vance. She wants to be the one who discovers the secret of the Haywood. She's been living in that archive for months. If you're looking for someone with the knowledge and the proximity, look there. Now get out of my way. I watched the Cadillac pull away into the late afternoon traffic. That made 3 suspects who were all pointing fingers at each other, and one recipe that didn't fit any of them. I spent another hour checking on Dr. Elena Vance's background from a phone booth. She was brilliant, she was broke, and she was the last person seen near the vault. But she didn't seem the type to leave a theatrical clue. She was too clinical, too cold. By the time I headed back to the brownstone, my feet were barking and my brain was spinning. I had a gambler with a motive, a collector with an obsession, and a scholar with the opportunity. But as I walked up the stoop and let myself in, I smelled something that shifted the whole perspective. It was the scent of clarified butter and shallots drifting from the kitchen, but underneath it, there was a sharper, more medicinal smell. I went into the office. Wolfe was still in his chair, but the forged recipe was gone from his desk. In its place was a small silver tray. On the tray sat a single pearl-headed TPN, identical to the one Vane had described. "Where did that come from?" I asked, dropping my hat on the rack. "It was found by Fritz," Wolfe said, his voice dangerously quiet. "In the herb locker. Someone has not only entered this house, Archie, they have left a message in my kitchen. They are no longer just baiting me, they are trespassing. The sanctity of the brownstone had been broken for Nero Wolfe. That wasn't just a crime, it was a declaration of war." I walked into the kitchen, where Fritz Brenner was standing over the butcher block with a look on his face that suggested someone had just suggested he use canned gravy. Fritz has been the culinary soul of the brownstone for years, and his composure is usually as unshakable as a well-set soufflé. But now his hands were trembling lightly as he held a sprig of tarragon. On the counter next to him sat the herb locker, its small wooden drawers pulled out in a row like a set of panicked teeth. "Archie," Fritz said, his voice a strained whisper. "I did not hear the doorbell. I did not hear a footfall. I went to the pantry for the shallots, and when I returned to the locker to prepare the seasoning for the fricandeau, it was the sticking into the wood of the third drawer, the one for the chervil." "Take it easy, Fritz," I said, though I felt a prickle of sweat at the back of my neck. "Did you see anyone in the hallway? Any deliveries?" "Nothing. The service door was locked. The front door was bolted. Only you and Mr. Wolfe have keys, and Mr. Wolfe was in the office." I went back into the office where Wolfe was staring at the second hatpin on the silver tray. The room was thick with the silence that always precedes one of his more volcanic eruptions. To anyone else, a hatpin in a spice drawer is a prank. To Nero Wolfe, it was an assassination attempt on his peace of mind. The brownstone was his fortress, his shell, and someone had slipped through the cracks as if they were made of smoke. "Well," I said, sitting at my desk and pulling the typewriter toward me, "the thief has a sense of theatre, and a key, or a very talented set of lockpicks. How do you want to play it? We can have the house swept for bugs, or I can sit on the stoop with a shotgun and wait for the ghost to return." "Do not be fatuous, Archie," Wolfe growled. His eyes were fixed on the pearl head of the pin. "The person who did this did not come to steal. They came to demonstrate. They are showing me that my walls are porous and my security is an illusion. It is a classic gambit of psychological erosion. They want me distracted. They want me defensive. It's working," I pointed out. "Fritz is ready to jump out of his skin, and you haven't touched your beer in 10 minutes. If this is a play, the director knows you're blocking perfect." "Fly." Wolfe leaned back, the chair groaning under his weight. "Consider the timing. You were at the Sterling Hale interviewing the suspects. While you were occupied with the scholar, the bibliographer, and the predator, the thief was here. It suggests a proximity that is uncomfortable. It suggests that while you were watching them, one of them, or an agent of theirs, was watching us. I wasn't fool." "Load," I said firmly. "I checked, twice. If someone got in here, they didn't tail me from 72nd Street, then they were already here," Wolfe murmured. He closed his eyes. "Archie, the recipe, the one Vane brought, Bring it to me. I fetched the forged recipe for quenelles de brochet from the safe, where I'd tucked it for security. Wolfe took it, handling the paper by the edges. He studied. The handwriting again, his lips moving slightly as if he were tasting the words. "This is not a simple forgery," he said. "The slant of the L, the way the T is crossed with a slight downward hook, it is an exact mimicry of Marco's hand. Marco has been dead for 3 years. His papers were willed to the Culinary Institute, but a few of his personal journals were kept by his niece. Tell me, Archie, in your research of the Sterling Hale staff, did the name Borgia appear?" "No Borgias," I said. "Just Vanes, Vances and Penhaligons." "Why?" "Marco's niece married a man named Vance, a cousin of the young doctor you met today, perhaps. Or perhaps a coincidence I do not believe in." Wolfe tapped the paper. "Dr. Elena Vance is a scholar of the Elizabethan era. She would know that a manuscript. P.T. by Hayward is not just a play, it is a cipher. Hayward was known for embedding political secrets in his subplots. If she has found a connection between that manuscript and a modern secret, her ambition would be more than academic. It would be mercenary. But why the kitchen, I asked. If she's a scholar, why play games with Fritz's herb locker? Because, Wolfe said, his voice dropping to a slow, dangerous rumble, she, or whoever is directing this, knows that the only way to truly unbalance me is to threaten the order of this house. They are not looking for the manuscript, Archie. They have the manuscript. They are looking for a witness. A witness to what? To the provenance of the paper. Julian Van said the manuscript was a donation from Beatrice Sterling. But if that manuscript W. as never hers to give, if it was stolen decades ago and hidden in the Sterling Hale, then its sudden disappearance is not a theft, but a reclamation. And the recipe? It is a reminder of a debt I owe to a dead friend. The doorbell rang then, sharp and insistent. I looked at the monitor. It was Julian Vane again, but he wasn't alone. Standing behind him was a woman in a heavy fur coat, her face obscure, red by a veil. She looked like she had stepped out of a funeral from 1920. "Company," I said, standing up. "Vane is back, and he's brought a widow. Or a very well-dressed ghost." "Bring them in," Wolfe said, his eyes snapping open. "And Archie, keep your hand near your pocket. If they have brought a third hat pin, I want to see where they intend to stick it." I went to the door, my mind racing. The case of the missing manuscript had started as a high-brow burglary, but it was turning into something much more personal. As I opened the door and let the cold air in, I realized that the thief wasn't just playing a game with Wolfe. They were rewriting the rules of the house, and in the brownstone, there's only room for one person to do that. Vane looked even worse than he had this morning. His E was crooked, and his eyes were bloodshot. The woman beside him didn't move an inch. She stood in the foyer like a statue, the scent of lilies and old dust clinging to her coat. "Mr. Wolfe," Vane gasped as they entered the office. "This is Mrs. Beatrice Sterling. She knows. She knows everything, and she says the manuscript wasn't stolen at all." Wolfe didn't stand. He didn't even blin. He just looked at the veiled woman and said, "I know, Mrs. Sterling. It's a pity you didn't tell Mr. Vane that you had already sold it twice." Mrs. Beatrice Sterling moved into the office with the stiff, brittle dignity of an heirloom that had survived one too many house fires. She didn't wait for an invitation to sit. She took the red leather chair as if she were reclaiming a throne. When she lifted her veil, I saw a face that was less a map of age and more a fortress of determination. Her eyes were a pale, watery blue, but they had the sharpness of a winter frost. Julian Vane hovered behind her, looking like a man who had accidentally discovered a bomb in his desk drawer and was waiting for it to go off. Wolfe remained motionless, his palms resting flat on the arms of his chair. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply watched her with the heavy, unblinking gaze that usually meant he was calculating the exact weight of a lie. The office was quiet enough to hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, where I hoped Fritz was recovering from his encounter with the herb locker. "You are a rude man, Mr. Wolfe," Beatrice Sterling said. Her voice was surprisingly deep, a resonant LTO that filled the room without effort. "But I suppose brilliance often lacks the grace of good manners. Julian tells me you have become obsessed with a recipe. I find that absurd. I am here because my family's reputation is being dragged through the mud by a collection of bureaucrats and a nephew who couldn't find his own shadow in a lit room. I am not obsessed with recipes, madam, Wolfe replied. IED, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. I am obsessed with the truth. A recipe was used as a signature in a crime committed within an institution you fund. A second signature was left in my own kitchen this afternoon. Do not mistake my silence for indifference. I am merely waiting for you to explain why you told Mr. Vane the manuscript was stolen when, in fact, you knew it had been removed by you. Our own hand. Vane made a choking sound. Mrs. Sterling, you took it. The old woman didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Wolfe. I did not take it, Mr. Wolfe. I reclaimed it. The Hayward manuscript was never meant to be public. It was a private trust, given to the archive under the condition of absolute discretion. When I discovered that Dr. Vance was planning to publish a monograph, T would expose certain familial associations within the text, I acted. The manuscript is currently in a safe place. I am here to tell you to stop your investigation. If you have the manuscript, Mrs. Sterling, then why are you here? I asked, leaning against the edge of my desk. If the case is closed, you could have just sent a telegram. You didn't come here to stop Wolfe. You came here because someone else stole it from you after you stole it from the vault. She turned her frost-blue eyes on me, and for a second I felt like I was back in the 3rd grade getting caught with a slingshot. You are remarkably perceptive for a man who spends his time chasing after taxicabs, Mr. Goodwin. Yes. I moved the manuscript to my private safe at home on Sunday night. On Monday morning, the safe was empty. No damage, no forced entry. Just a single pearl-headed hatpin left on the velvet lining. Wolfe's eyebrows went up a fraction of an inch, his version of a theatrical gasp. Then we have a hierarchy of thieves. You bypass the archive's security, and someone far more intimate with your habits, bypassed yours. And they are using the iconography of my past to taunt us both. Who knew you were moving it? I asked. No one, she snapped, except perhaps my nephew Marcus, who has the unfortunate habit of listening at doors, and Silas Thorne has been pestering me for months, claiming the manuscript belongs in a true collection. But they wouldn't know about the other thing being the recipe, Wolfe said. Mr. Vane, you mentioned that Dr. Elena Vank. E is a relative of the man who married Marko Vukcic's niece. Is she aware of the connection between this house and the papers of the late Mr. Vukcic? Vane blinked, looking confused. I don't know. Dr. Vance is very private. She's focused entirely on the Elizabethan ciphers. She believes the Hayward play contains a hidden map to a series of properties in London that were once owned by the CRO. It's all very academic, or so I thought. It is not academic, Beatrice Sterling interrupted. Those properties weren't in London. They were here, in New York, part of a colonial land grant that my family has built its entire fortune upon. If that manuscript proves the grant was fraudulent, the Sterling Hale archive, my estate, and the very ground we are sitting on would be subject to a legal battle that would last a century. Wolfe shifted his weight, the chair groaning in protest. The stakes had just moved from a missing piece of paper to the very foundation of a New York dynasty. But more importantly, to Wolfe, the thief was playing a game of intellectual chess, using the memories of his oldest friend as the pieces. Archie, Wolfe said, and I knew that tone. It was the one that meant, I wouldn't be seeing my bed for a while. We need more than legwork now. We need a specialist. Call Saul Panzer. Tell him I need him to look into the recent acquisitions of Silas Thorne. But more importantly, I want him to find the current whereabouts of a woman named Maria Vance, the niece of Marko. You think the scholar is working with her own family? I asked. I think, Wolfe said, that we are dealing with a grudge that has been simmering for 3 years. Someone believes I failed Marko in some way, and they are using this manuscript to draw me into a trap. Mrs. Sterling, you will return to your home. Do not speak to your nephew. Mr. Vane, you will go back to the archive and act as if you are still in despair. Archie, see them out. As I led them to the door, I looked at the silver tray in the office, 2 hatpins, 1 recipe, and a manuscript that could topple a fortune. The air in the brownstone felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were waiting for the third act to begin. I picked up the phone to call Saul, wondering if the ghost in the kitchen was done for the day, or if they were just getting started. Saul Panzer arrived at the brownstone at 7 o'clock, just as the CI, "Thank you," was beginning to tuck itself under a blanket of grey slush. To look at Saul, you'd think he was a guy who spent his life waiting for a bus that never came, undersized, wearing a cap that had seen better decades, and possessing a nose that seemed to be leading him toward a destination he wasn't quite sure of. But in the world of private inquiry, Saul was the ace in the hole. He had a memory like a steel trap, and a way of fading into the wallpaper that made him the most dangerous man in any room. I let him in, and he gave me a quick nod before heading straight for the office. Wolfe was in his chair, a glass of beer in hand, looking like a Buddha who had just found a fly in his tea. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. Wolfe respects Saul because Saul is efficient, and efficiency is the on. Lee Thing Wolfe prizes more than a perfectly roasted squab. "Saul," Wolfe said, gesturing toward the red chair, "I have a problem that requires a delicacy of touch. Archie has been stomping through the front doors of our suspects, but I need someone to look at the back windows, specifically those belonging to Silas Thorne and a woman named Maria Vance." Saul sat, his eyes already sharp and focused. "I've heard Thorne's name, Mr. Wolfe. He's a collector who doesn't like to lose. What am I looking for?" "The Haywood Manuscript," Wolfe said, "but not just the paper. I want to know who has been visiting him in the last 48 hours. And Maria Vance, she is the widow of the nephew of my late friend Marko Vucic. She lives in a brownstone on 84th Street. I suspect she is the Bry. DGE between the archive and the provocation I received today." I leaned against my desk, watching them. "You think Maria is the one who slipped into the kitchen? She'd have to be a shadow to get past Fritz." "Or she had help," Wolfe replied. "Archie, the hat pin. It is a specific tool. It is not merely a fastener, it is a weapon of a bygone era. It suggests a person who values the old ways of doing things." "Saul, I want you to find out if Silas Thorne has recently purchased any items belonging to the Vucic estate, if Maria Vance is selling her uncle's secrets to fund a scholar's ambition. We have our motive." Saul nodded, scribbling a few notes in a tiny book. "I'll start with Thorne's household staff. The butler has a weakness for the ponies. He'll talk for a $50 bill and a tip-on. The 5th race at Aqueduct. By morning, I'll tell you who's been in that house." As Saul slipped back out into the night, the house settled into that peculiar, high-tension quiet that always precedes a storm. I went to the kitchen to check on Fritz. He was plating the fricandeau, but his eyes kept darting toward the herb locker. It was a breach of his sanctuary, and for a man like Fritz, that was worse than a physical assault. "Fritz," I said, leaning on the counter, "you've known Marco's family for a long time. Did you ever meet Maria?" Fritz paused, a silver spoon hovering over a platter. "Only once, Archie, at the funeral. She was cold, not with grief, but with a kind of anger. She felt that Marco had spent too much of his life and his money on his friends and his food, rather than in his own blood. She looked at this house as if it were built with her inheritance." "That's a hell of a motive for a hatpin," I muttered. Dinner was a somber affair. Wolfe ate with his usual mechanical precision, but he didn't speak a word. He was ruminating, his mind working through the permutations of the case like a grandmaster at a chessboard. When we returned to the office, he didn't pick up a book. Instead, he sat and watched the clock. At 10:30 the phone rang. It was Saul. I took it at my desk and signaled for Wolfe to pick up his extension. "I'm at a drugstore near Thorne's place," Saul's voice crackled. "You were right about the visitors, Mr. Wolfe. Maria Vance was there yesterday afternoon. She didn't come in the front, she was let in through the service entrance by Thorne's PR. Ivate secretary. But there's more. Thorne didn't buy the manuscript from her. He's holding it as collateral. Collateral for what?" Wolfe asked. "For a debt," Saul replied. "It seems Maria's cousin, the doctor at the archive, got herself into a bit of a mess. She was using archive funds to finance her research into those colonial land grants, and Thorne found out. He's been squeezing her, Maria S. Told the manuscript from Mrs. Sterling's safe to pay off Thorn and save her cousin from prison. But why the recipe? I broke in. Why the games with Wolfe? That wasn't Thorn, Saul said, and it wasn't the doctor. According to the butler, Maria Vance has been talking about settling the bill with a man in a brownstone for years. She thinks Mr. Wolfe cheated her out of her uncle's legacy. E-recipe was her way of telling him that she's the one in control now. She's the one who knows where the bodies and the manuscripts are buried. Wolfe's face didn't change, but I saw his knuckles whiten. Where is the manuscript now, Saul? Thorn has it in his library safe. He's planning to discover it in a week or two, after the archive officially declares it lost. He'll look like a hero. The Sterling Hale will be in his debt, and Maria Vance will have her revenge. Not quite, Wolfe said. Saul, stay where you are. I want you to watch that house. Archie, get your coat. We are going to provide Mr. Thorn with an opportunity to be a hero much sooner than he anticipated. We? I asked, grabbing my hat. You're leaving the house? I am going to the foyer, Wolfe corrected me, his voice dripping with irony. I am summoning the principals. If Maria Vance wants to settle the bill, she shall have her accounting. Call them all. Tell them the Hayward manuscript has been found, and the final act is about to begin in this office. The following hour was a study in controlled chaos, or at least as much chaos as I'm allowed to generate within the four walls of the brownstone. I spent 40 minutes on the telephone, using a voice that was 1 part invitation and 3 parts subpoena. I told Julian Vane that the archive's reputation was dangling by a thread, and he'd better be here to catch it. I told Silas Thorn that Mr. Wolfe had a piece of information regarding the Sterling Hale theft that would make his morning headlines look very different if he wasn't present to discuss it. I told Dr. Elena Vance that her research into colonial land grants had reached a very public conclusion. Lastly, I called Maria Vance. Her voice on the other end was like a thin sheet of ice over a deep pond. She didn't sound surprised. She sounded like someone who had been waiting for the phone to ring for 3 years. She agreed to come, not out of fear, but out of a dark, simmering curiosity. And I hung up. I looked at Wolfe. He had retreated into a state of absolute stillness, his eyes closed, his chin resting on his chest. To the uninitiated, he looked like he was napping. To me, he looked like a power plant hummed at maximum capacity just before the switches are thrown. They're coming, I said, checking my watch. All of them. Even Thorn. He sounded like he wanted to chew the receive. But he's too worried about his reputation to stay away. Do you want me to have Saul come in from the cold? No, Wolfe murmured without opening his eyes. Saul is to remain outside. If anyone attempts to depart before I am finished, he will provide the necessary discouragement. And Archie, tell Fritz to prepare the office. 6 chairs in a semicircle, and a tray with 6 glasses of water. Not. Hing else. No beer, no snacks. This is not a social call, it is a reckoning. The weight of the silence in the house grew heavier as the minutes ticked by. It wasn't the comfortable silence of a late-night book. It was the pressurized quiet of a courtroom. I went through the ritual of checking the office, straightening the pens on my desk, ensuring the recording device was ready, and making sure my shoulder holster wasn't bunched up under my coat. In this house, we don't use the brute force Vane had been so worried about, but a little insurance never hurt when you're inviting a group of people who are all lying to each other. Fritz appeared, moving like a ghost. He placed the tray of water on the small table near the red chair. He looked at Wolfe, then at me, and I saw the tension in his jaw. Oh, the breach of his kitchen was still an open wound. The door, Archie, he whispered. The first one is here. It was Julian Vane, looking like he'd been pulled through a knothole. He was followed 10 minutes later by Dr. Elena Vance, who walked in with her head held high, though her eyes were darting around the room, looking for the exits she'd already mapped out in her mind. Then came Silas T. Horn, radiating a cold industrial power that didn't quite mask the flicker of uncertainty in his gaze. He sat as far from Vane as possible. Finally, the front door opened one last time. I didn't need the monitor to know who it was. The air in the foyer seemed to drop 5 degrees. Maria Vance entered the office. She was dressed in black, a sharp contrast to the warm wood and leather of Wolfe's sanctuary. She didn't look at the other suspects. She looked directly at Wolfe, her expression a mask of elegant spite. "So," she said, a voice cutting through the room like a blade, "the great Nero Wolfe has finally bestirred himself. Did you find the recipe to your liking, Mr. Wolfe? Or was the seasoning too bitter for your refined palate?" Wolfe opened his eyes. He didn't look at her with Ange. He looked at her with a profound, weary disappointment. The seasoning, madam, was theatrical, and like most theatre, it relied on a suspension of disbelief that I am unwilling to grant. Please sit. We have much to discuss, and I find the act of looking up at people to be physically taxing. They sat. The circle was complete. The silence that followed was different now. It was the silence of a trapped audience. I took my place at my desk, my notebook open, my pen ready. I could see the sweat on Vane's forehead and the rigid set of Thorne's shoulders. Elena Vance was staring at the floor, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Wolfe let the silence stretch. He let it press down on them until Vane looked like he was about to scream. It's a classic Wolfe move, using the weight of his own presence to make the guilty feel the air thinning. He took a slow, deliberate breath, his chest expanding under his yellow silk vest, and began to speak in a voice that was barely above a whisper, yet it carried to every corner of the room. "We are here," Wolfe began, "because a piece of paper has been stolen. But we are also here because a legacy has been twisted, a manuscript by Mas Hayward, a forgery of a recipe, and a pearl-headed hatpin. These are the elements of a play that has been staged for my benefit. But the problem with staging a play in this office is that I am the only one allowed to write the ending." He turned his gaze towards Silas Thorne. "Mr. Thorne, you have something in your safe that does not belong to you, and you," his eyes shifted to Elena Vance, a debt that you thought could be paid in history. But history is not a currency. It is a debt that eventually collects itself." I watched Maria Vance. She hadn't blinked. She was waiting for the moment of impact, the moment when she could finally strike back at the man she blamed for her own misfortunes. But as Wolfe continued, the confidence in her eyes began to flicker. She had brought her to the brownstone, but she had forgotten one thing. Nero Wolfe never fights on anyone's terms but his own. The office was illuminated by the soft, directional glow of the desk lamps, casting long, architectural shadows across the faces of the 5 people seated before Nero Wolfe. It was a tableau of New York's upper crust and intellectual fringe, all of them brought low by a common thread of greed and a single missing manuscript. Wolfe sat behind his desk, his palms resting flat on the polished wood, looking less like a detective and more like a grand inquisitor who had already reached his verdict but was savoring the process of the confession. I leaned back in my swivel chair, my hand near the drawer where I keep the insurance policy. The atmosphere was so thick you could have cut it with a palette knife. Julian Vane looked like he was vibrating out of his tweed suit. Silas Thorne sat like a stone monument to his own importance. Dr. Elena Vance was a study in brittle academic nerves, and Maria was the only one who looked Wolfe in the eye. She had the look of a person who had planted a bomb and was waiting for the ticking to stop. "The problem with an intellectual challenge," Wolfe began, his voice a smooth, resonant baritone that filled the room without effort, "is that the challenger often assumes the opponent is playing the same game. You, Mrs. Vance, believed this was a game of sentiment and retribution. You, Mr. Thorne, believed it was a game of acquisition. And you, Doctor, believed it was a game of survival. You were all mistaken. This is a game of logic, and logic is a cold master." Wolfe shifted his gaze to Silas Thorne. "Let us start with you, Mr. Thorne. You are a man of vast resources but limited imagination. You wanted the Hayward manuscript not for its literary merit but for the power it conferred over the Sterling estate. You knew of the colonial land grant discrepancies. You were waiting for the archive to falter so you could swoop in as a savior while clutching the very evidence that would bankrupt the Sterling family. But you didn't steal it. You are too cautious for a felony. You merely provided the market for the thief." Thorne's face reddened, his jaw tightening. "That is an outrageous accusation, Wolfe. I am a benefactor of the arts. You are a scavenger of the arts, Wolfe snapped, the word hitting the room like a physical blow. Do not interrupt me. You accepted the manuscript as collateral from Maria Vance, knowing full well it was stolen from the archive and subsequently stolen from Beatrice Sterling's private safe. You are currently an accessory to grand larceny. He then turned to Elena Vance. The young scholar flinched as his eyes landed on her. Doctor, your ambition was your undoing. You discovered truth in the Hayward ciphers, that the Sterling fortune was built on a fraudulent grant. You feared that if the manuscript remained in the archive, it would eventually be discovered by someone less sympathetic to your need for funding. You approached your cousin Maria for advice. It was a fatal error. You thought you were protecting history. You were merely providing Maria with the weapon he had been seeking for 3 years. I didn't want it stolen, Elena whispered, her voice cracking. I just wanted to ensure my research was the first to bring it to light. I needed the archive to stay open. Without the Sterling endowment, I have nothing. And so you allowed the manuscript to be protected into disappearance, Wolfe said dryly. But Maria had other plans she didn't care about. Land grants or Elizabethan plays. She cared about the ghost of Marko Vukcic. Now Wolfe looked at Maria Vance. The silence between them was different. It was personal. You entered this house, Maria, not through the door, but through the memory of a dead man. You obtained a key to the service entrance years ago, when Marko was still alive and treated you like a daughter. You kept it. You waited. Hen, your cousin, came to you with her academic panic. You saw an opportunity. You stole the manuscript from the archive using the biometric data your cousin provided. Then you stole it again from Mrs. Sterling's safe, after she had tried to reclaim it herself. But the manuscript was only half the prize. The other half was my humiliation. Maria smiled then. It wasn't a pleasant sight. You let him die, Nero. You and your high-priced appetites. You sat in this chair while my uncle spent his life catering to your whims and your stomach, and when he was gone you didn't even ensure his family was seen to. You kept his secrets, his recipes, his prestige. I wanted to show you that your fortress is made of paper. I wanted to see you scramble for a missing book while I held the very thing that mad. You feel superior to the world. You left a recipe, Wolfe said, his voice dropping to a whisper. A forgery of Marko's hand. You used a pearl-headed hatpin, a gift Marko gave your mother. You violated the kitchen of a man, Fritz Brenner, who loved your uncle more than you ever did. You think you were honoring Marko? You were desecrating his memory for the sake of a petty grudge. And in your to hurt me, you handed the manuscript to a man like Thorne, believing you could control him. I have the manuscript, Maria said defiantly, and you have nothing but a tray of water and a lot of words. No, Wolfe said, leaning forward. Mr. Thorne has the manuscript, and at this moment Saul Panzer is standing outside Mr. Thorne's library window with a camera and a police sergeant from the 19th precinct. Mr. Thorne's butler, it seems, is a man of many debts and very few loyalties. He was more than happy to show the police where the lost manuscript was being kept for safekeeping. The colour drained from Thorne's face. He stood up, but my hand was already on the grip of my Colt, and he saw it. He sat back down. The play is over, Maria, Wolfe said, his eyes cold and final. The manuscript is recovered. The fraud of the Sterling grant will be settled in a court of law, not a thief's kitchen, and you will be leaving this house not with a victory, but with a police escort. Wolfe rang the bell on his desk. It was the signal for Fritz to open the front door for the men waiting on the stoop. The tension in the room didn't break. It shattered. The front door didn't just open. It felt as though the very atmosphere of the brownstone shifted to accommodate the inevitable. Inspector Kramer of Manhattan Homicide didn't usually handle manuscript thefts, but when Nero Wolfe calls the police commissioner's office with a tip about a $400,000 felony and a potential riot on West 35th Street, people move. Kramer entered the office with his hat pull. Ed Lowe and a half-chewed cigar clamped between his teeth, followed by two plainclothesmen who looked entirely too large for the room. Kramer didn't look at Wolfe. He looked at the suspects, All right, Wolfe, I've got a team at the Thorne residence on Park Avenue. They just radioed in. Your man Panzer pointed right to a floor safe behind a portrait of a very ugly horse. The Hayward manuscript is in custody. Now, do you want to tell me who I'm taking in, or should I just flip a coin? Wolfe didn't even glance up. He was busy pouring a fresh glass of beer, his movements as precise as a chemist's. The coin is unnecessary, Inspector. The culpability is distributed, but the criminal intent is concentrated. Mr. Thorne is your host for the evening. He accepted stolen property with the full knowledge. GE of its provenance. Dr. Vance here provided the technical means for the initial breach. But the hand that moved the pieces, the hand that invaded my home and violated the sanctity of the sterling safe, belongs to Maria Vance. Maria stood up. She didn't look like a defeated woman. She looked like a martyr who had been cheated of her stake. You think you've won, Nero? You've recovered a dusty pile. Paper. But I've proven what I came to prove. You're a prisoner in this house, surrounded by ghosts you're too afraid to face. My uncle is dead, and you're just a fat man waiting for his next meal. I am a man who respects the truth, Wolfe said, his voice like iron. You, however, are a woman who mistakes spite for justice. You didn't steal that manuscript to help your cousin or to expose the sterling fraud. You stole it because you couldn't bear the fact that Marco left his legacy to those who understood his heart, rather than those who simply shared his blood. You used his handwriting to mock me, but in doing so, you revealed your own incompetence. A true student of Marco would have known that he never used chervil in his quenelles de brochet. It was his one culinary prejudice. Your forgery was as loud as a trumpet blast. Fritz, standing in the doorway, nodded once, his face grim. The insult to the herb locker had been answered. Kramer gestured to his men. Take them. Thorne, you're coming too. We'll talk about safekeeping at the precinct. The room cleared out with the efficiency of a receding tide. Thorne was blustering about his lawyers. Elena Vance was weeping quay. Etley into a handkerchief, and Maria Vance was silent, her eyes fixed on Wolfe until the moment the office door closed behind her. The heavy thud of the front door echoed through the house, signaling the end of the intrusion. I stood by the window and watched the squad cars pull away. The street was quiet again. I turned back to the office, which suddenly felt much larger and significantly emptier. Wolfe was leaning back, his eyes closed, the glass of beer half finished on his desk. He looked exhausted, though he hadn't moved more than 6 inches in 3 hours. Well, I said, sitting back at my desk, that was a lot of mileage for a play that only ran one night. Do you think the sterling woman will actually lose her fortune over those land grants? It is of no consequence to us, Archie, Wolfe murmured. The archive will survive, or it will not. The law will decide the fate of the sterling land. My concern was the preservation of my house and the reputation of my friend. The manuscript was merely the vehicle for a more personal assault. And the hatpins? I asked. What do I do with the one on the tray? Dispose of it, Wolfe said. It is a relic of a mind that preferred piercing to understanding. And Archie, yeah? Tell Fritz that we shall have dinner in 20 minutes. And tell him the chervil is safe. I went to the kitchen. Fritz was already at work, his movements fluid and confident once more. The herb locker was closed, its drawers neatly aligned. The smell of the fricandeau was filling the air, rich and comforting. I leaned against the doorframe. What tea? Hing him for a second. He says the chervil is safe, Fritz. Fritz smiled, a small, genuine expression that reached his eyes. It was never in doubt, Archie. Mr. Wolfe knows. He always knows. I walked back through the foyer, checking the bolts on the front door. The case of the missing manuscript was headed for the files, another entry in the long record of human folly and intellectual vanity. BU. As I looked at the shadow of the orchid elevator on the wall, I knew that for Wolfe, it wasn't about the money or the history. It was about the fact that even in a world of thieves and gamblers, there are some things, like a friend's handwriting or a chef's secret, that are worth defending with everything you've got. I sat down at my typewriter to finish the report. The brownstone was silent again, the way it was meant to be. The following morning, the sun managed to find its way through the New York smog, casting a clean, indifferent light across the office floor. The red leather chair was empty, the silver tray had been polished and returned to the sideboard, and the 2 pearl-headed hatpins were currently at the bottom of a trash bin in the basement. I was at my desk, finishing the FINA. Dictated report for the Sterling Hale archive. It was a lengthy document, mostly because I had to find a way to explain how a $400,000 manuscript had been used as a pawn in a 3-year-old grudge involving a dead chef and a spice drawer without making everyone involved sound like they belonged in a padded cell. Wolfe was where he always is between the hours of 9 and 11, upstairs in the plant rooms. I could hear the faint rhythmic hum of the elevator as it made its journey back down to the ground floor. When the doors slid open, Wolfe stepped out, looking refreshed. He had spent 2 hours among the Cattleya and Cypripedium, and the scent of damp moss and expensive mulch seemed to cling to his silk sleeves. He crossed the room, navigated the vast territory of tea, rug, and lowered himself into his chair with a grunt of satisfaction. "Archie," he said, tapping a finger on the desk. "Has Mr. Vane settled the account?" "The check arrived by messenger an hour ago," I said, spinning the slip of paper around so he could see the figures. "It includes a substantial bonus for discretion. I think Mrs. Sterling realized that if the details of her own little Midney heist at the archive ever got out, her social standing would have the lifespan of a snowball in a furnace. He's paying us to keep her name out of the headlines, which is fine by me. The bank doesn't care if the money comes from a scholar or a reformed thief." Wolfe glanced at the check and nodded. "It is adequate. It covers the insult to the house, if not the assault on my peace. Have you R&D from Saul?" "He's fine. He's currently at the DA's office giving a statement about the floor safe in Thorne's library. Thorne is trying to claim he was protecting the manuscript for the public good, but the DA isn't buying it. As for Maria Vance, she's being held without bail. She didn't have much to say this morning, except to ask if you were still eating like a king while the rest of the woe. RLD starved. I told her you were currently debating the merits of a 3rd butter sauce, which I thought was a nice touch." Wolfe's eyes darkened for a moment. "She is a tragic creature, Archie, not because of her circumstances, but because of her perspective. She looked at Marco's life and saw only what was denied to her. She failed to see that a legacy is not a ledger of assets to be inherited. T is a standard to be maintained. By attempting to use his hand to strike at me, she proved she never truly knew him. Marco would have been more offended by her poor calligraphy than her criminal intent." Fritz appeared in the doorway carrying a tray with 2 bottles of beer and a glass. He placed them on Wolfe's desk with a flourish. There was a new lightness in Fritz's step. The herb locker had been sanitized, the intruder had been purged, and the kitchen was once again a sovereign state. "The lunch, Mr. Wolfe," Fritz said, his voice brimming with professional pride. "It will be the poulet en gelée. I have prepared the tarragon specifically as you requested." "Thank you, Fritz," Wolfe said, his voice softening. "And the chervil?" Fritz beamed. "It is untouched, monsieur. Pristine." As Fritz retreated to his domain, Wolfe poured his beer with a steady hand. He watched the head rise to the rim of the glass and stop precisely where it should. It was a small moment of order in a world that, for the last 48 hours, had been remarkably disorderly. "You know," I said, leaning back and putting my feet up on the edge of the desk, a move Wolfe detests but tolerates when we've just closed a case. "She was right about one thing. This house is a fortress, but it's a weird one. Most people build walls to keep the world out because they're afraid of it. You build walls because the world is too loud, too messy, and too poorly seasoned for your taste. You didn't take this case for the money or even for the manuscript. You took it because someone tried to change the menu." Wolfe took a long, slow sip of his beer. He wiped his lips with his handkerchief and looked at me, his eyes sharp and unreadable. "The world, Archie, is a chaotic theatre of human folly. Most men spend their lives reacting to the noise. I prefer to conduct the orchestra from a comfortable chair. When someone attempts to seize the baton, they must be reminded that the music does not belong to them. It belongs to the logic of the composition." "And Maria?" I asked. "And the ghost of Marco?" "Marco is not a ghost," Wolfe said firmly. "He is a set of principles. He understood that excellence is its own justification. Maria sought to use excellence as a weapon, and in doing so she blunted it. She has lost because she valued the spite of the present over the integrity of the past. He picked up a book from his desk, a new biography of a forgotten statesman, and opened it to the first chapter. The conversation was over. The case of the missing manuscript was officially relegated to the dead files. Outside, the traffic on West 35th Street continued its mindless roll toward the river. But inside the brownstone, the clocks were synchronized, the orchids were blooming, and the veal was marinating. "Archie," Wolfe said, without looking up from his page. "Yeah? Remind me to never accept a case involving a bibliographer. They are a damp and tiresome breed." "You got it," I said, reaching for my hat. "I'll put it on the list right under blackmailers and opal who like well-done steak." I walked out to the foyer, feeling the solid weight of the house around me. It wasn't just a building, it was an idea. And as long as Nero Wolfe was in his chair and Fritz was in his kitchen, it was an idea that wasn't going anywhere. I stepped out onto the stoop, took a deep breath of the cold New York air, and headed toward the garage. We had a check to deposit, and I had a feeling that by tomorrow, someone else with a problem and a bank account would be ringing that doorbell looking for a bit of intellectual justice in a world that usually settles for less.